Hello, welcome to another episode of Self-Wired. I'll be going over part 3 of Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow. So we're going to be going over some more judgment biases, some intuition, and the best way to predict the future, as well as more reiteration of this idea of what you see is all there is. And obviously, the two systems of thinking fast and thinking slow. So he starts out this part by laying out some more biases, right? There's tons of them strewn throughout the book. These are two major ones that you can find examples of in your everyday life. It's easy to see these in yourself and in others all the time. These two are hindsight and outcome bias. So he gives the example of Google, right? You ever heard the phrase hindsight's 2020, right? You look back at Google and it's hard to imagine a world without it. Its success almost seems it it almost seems impossible for Google to have failed, right? And what this is this hindsight bias, right? If you tell the story of Google, you have this perfect narrative. The narrative makes perfect sense, right? These two kids out of Stanford come out. They're very creative. They have this idea of creating a platform that will allow you to find information easily on the internet. How could this fail? It almost did, right? They attempted to sell this for less than $1 million. I don't know how much Google is worth, but it's far exceeds less than $1 million, right? And so when you get this narrative of how Google was founded, it makes sense to you. You can have this tightly packed version of reality that, all the pieces are where they are. The puzzle makes sense. Of course Google succeeded, but Google could have failed in far more ways than the one way that it succeeded, right? But we don't see these non-realities, as Kahneman puts it. We have an issue thinking of a world in which Google doesn't exist. An outcome bias kind of tacks on to this idea of looking at something in hindsight and thinking that you understand it easily, when in reality it's a lot more complicated than you're able to see. A good example of this is the problem of like 9/11, right? Where you look at the facts of 9/11 and you see that it almost seems obvious that this would have happened. And a lot of people propose this idea that it should have been stopped before it was. And you see this in pretty much any disaster, where when you look at the statistics and the facts of the matter afterwards, it makes perfect sense that this disaster happened. And we blame these people that didn't step in and control this scenario before the event occurred. But in reality, what we're doing is seeing the narrative after the fact and blaming someone for not being able to predict the future, right? So again, what you see is all there is. When you have all the facts in front of you, you see the facts and you have this narrative and a coherent story about what happened, right? But in the moment, when the facts aren't neatly laid out in front of you, and when you don't have this laid out series of informative statistics and these informative facts about an event, it's very hard to measure out an appropriate reaction to an event that hasn't happened, obviously. But we don't act like this. System one comes in and kind of blocks out a lot of the information, and it's hard for us to sit back and go over the possibilities of the future. We're bad at predicting the future. Everyone is. Even the experts are fairly terrible at doing this. Something I'm going to get into later on in terms of using algorithms to predict the future, because algorithms are this perfect example of system 2 and its ability to look at objective reality. So this idea of looking at and having a having the capacity to predict, right? What's a better example of this than the stock market, right? Not quite. Kahneman actually himself went in and did an analysis of the stock market and found that there is a very, well, no, there's a non-existent um, prediction of success in the stock market, right? You have these professional stockbrokers that are unable to demonstrate something called persistent skill. And this is, persistent skill, it's a pretty obvious concept, right? If someone is consistently golfing with a high score, they're a skilled golfer, right? This is lacking in the stock market. These people are essentially rolling dice and coming out and having this illusion of validity where they believe that their predictions, because occasionally they're successful, they believe that their predictions are based in some form of skill. But this skill, when you look at it in terms of statistics, it doesn't exist, right? So we want to live in a world where we can predict the future, right? We want to live in a world where, in a semi-artificial environment where chaos is non-existent, you could say, where we can have some kind of professional, and this professional can be relied on to give an accurate assessment of what will happen next because they understand the subject. However, humans tend to be pretty bad at this, and that stock market example of a correlation of 0 between different years and the capacity for these stockbrokers to predict accurately successful stocks, this is a prime example, and it gets a lot scarier than just stockbrokers. They did a study where radiologists contradicted themselves 20% of the time at different points looking at the same picture of an x-ray of a chest, right? It's pretty terrifying. You want to believe that this experienced radiologist that you're going to will always give you the same assessment of the same picture clearly, right? So it's terrifying to think that we live in a world so complicated that our professionals can look at something and make a mistake even 1% of the time, right? That 1% of the time is, if they're seeing several people a year, that 1% is several people, right? So that's a terrifying idea. However, there is kind of a solution to this problem that, for reasons that Kahneman lays out, and sadly is kind of not taken too well by the general public. And this solution is simple algorithms, right? Automating this process. So automating this process and using simple algorithms, taking statistics from large case studies, plugging them into a computer, and having the computer predict an outcome is far more successful than humans at making predictions, even in things like, political and sociological futures that we attempt to predict and to gather information about. So algorithms are better at predicting the longevity in cancer patients, predicting the susceptibility to infants in terms of infant death syndrome, predicting business success, stability of foster parents, and even football games, right? And this is something that for some reason people shy away from. Like I said, this is something that they don't take too kindly of because, we don't want to allow computers to kind of take over our jobs of prediction and think that something as simple as using a few simple algorithms could do a better job than we can. This is kind of a terrifying idea. And this is something that Kahneman found when he was working for the Israeli military, attempting to find people that would be the best fit for a position of leadership, right? He didn't use a computer, but he used individual ratings in terms of assessing individual characteristics that would work best in a leadership position. And the people that he explained this to at the time were like, you're turning us into robots here. We want to sit down, use our intuition, and judge the person in front of us in terms of what we believe to be the best fit for a position of leadership. This idea of taking this person out and separating them into individual characteristics, rating each characteristic, doesn't appeal to the idea that we can be successful just in terms of judging an individual as a whole. And you see this a lot in simple job applications, or job interviews rather, where someone might be more qualified, but someone else who maybe is more charismatic can come in, demonstrate their likability, and the fact that this other individual has characteristics that would make them a better fit, like work experience, are kind of overridden by our susceptibility to, if you look at my part 1 analysis, something like facial structure, right? So it's kind of hard for us to accept the fact that a blocked off version and like a rating methodology would be better than our intuitions on an individual. We want to think that we're pretty good with this intuition. Which brings us into intuition as a whole, right? Kahneman points out, if you've ever read Blink by Malcolm Gladwell, great book, highly recommend it. It's all Blink, this idea that kind of your initial intuition can, on occasion, be extremely helpful. Sometimes it can lead us into some pretty tragic scenarios, which he also lays out, but occasionally in terms of trusting experts, these experts can use their intuition well. And Kahneman lays this out in attempts to take away some of this aura of mystery around intuition, which to the user of intuition, it seems a little bit mysterious. This idea that we can have a gut feeling about something that we can't necessarily explain, and this gut feeling can be right. It's actually incredibly simple if you think about it. You're recalling memories, right? However, long-term memory, you can't encompass the entirety of your long-term memory in your consciousness. Some of these memories are off limits to us. So part of the amazing components of the brain is that it does have access to some of these long-term memories, and it can utilize all of them at once in some scenarios, namely environments that have that are sufficiently regular and sufficiently predictable, right? So Gladwell, in his book Blink, lays out this story of art judges. And so there was this piece of art that, if it was real, would be a great find. It would sell for, X amount of money, and the owner of this artwork would be very rich, and the people that bought it would be very happy to have found such a beautiful piece of art. However, they had several art judges look at this, and none of them could really point to what was wrong with the art piece, but all of them had this gut feeling that the art piece was a fake. And more analysis pointed to their intuition being correct, that this art was in fact fake, and that it wasn't worth the amount that they had hoped it would be. It wasn't as important as they hoped it would be. Well, what was going on here? These art judges had looked at countless numbers of art pieces, and they had seen real art and they had seen fake art over and over and over again. And while they couldn't articulate rationally why was this one piece of art a fake, their long-term memory had hundreds and hundreds of opportunities where they had seen fake art pieces. They knew what it looked like in a kind of intangible way, and they were able to draw on this. And you see the same thing, a great example is chess players, where they've seen so many different versions of a chess game that it's easy for them, and they don't really necessarily have to think through different options all the time. They see a movement and they see the layout of the board, and they've seen this layout countless times. It's in their long-term memory. They can recall it easily. They don't have to oscillate between two different versions of how this could go out. Whereas a amateur chess player would have to. They have this wealth of information that they can call on easily and bring to memory in an almost unconscious fashion. And another example is firefighters, where sometimes these firefighters will be in a burning building and they'll have this tug of intuition and they'll go, we need to get everyone out of this building immediately, then the building collapses. Well, they've been in countless environments, both artificial and real, where they've seen the telltale signs of a collapsing building. They can't point to a beam that's shaking or a floor pattern or whatever. They would look at and go, rationally, I know that this is a telltale sign that the building will collapse, but their overall expertise allows them to automatically know. And this isn't a mystery. We understand this very well. It's a large wealth of information stored in your long-term memory that you're able to recall easily, right? So this is an instance where you can, in fact, trust an expert, right? Kahneman actually wrote an article about when you can do this, and what they found was that these are... When you can trust an expert is when that expert works in an environment that is sufficiently regular to be predictable, or when they have an opportunity to learn regularities through prolonged practice, right? So chess firefighters, art judges, for example. These are nurses is another example, where they're in this environment where there's enough repetition and there's enough structure to the environment to see repetition, right? So outside view, right? This idea of objectively looking at something. So Kahneman lays out this idea that, well, this project he was working on where he was essentially building a curriculum. And he spoke with one of his colleagues and was kind of bummed out to find that a lot of these attempts at building a curriculum from scratch fail, right? And not only do they fail, but they often, if they do succeed, they often take a long, long time to build, right? And so before he had this conversation, he asked all of his colleagues to make a prediction about how long this project would take. And the kind of mean score was about 2 years, right? The lower quartile or whatever of the predictions was 1 year, and it stretched on to like 3 to 4 years. Most of them were, we're looking at, a few years. And then after this conversation, he found that, no one had ever really successfully done this in less than 7 years. And, he's kind of, struck by this proclivity he had to what he later called a planning fallacy, where he was looking at their project and he's going, we're starting off pretty well. We have this amount of work done. If we stay on this trajectory, we'll be done in no time. But the problem with that is you're not looking at other people who have done this same project and looking at the statistical facts behind what a project like this entails. When you do, that you get the outside view rather than the inside view, which is your own subjective, biased opinion on how quickly you and your colleagues can work. So this is something that you can utilize even if you're not building a curriculum from scratch, which I feel as though very few people are probably going to do. You can see this in terms of something like planning a budget for remodeling a kitchen, as he points out. A lot of these times people are doing a remodeling in their house. They have the X amount of money that they're planning to spend, but then you begin the work. It takes far longer than you thought, and moreover, there are more additions that you want after you see some of the work done. And so a lot of these people that give the service of remodeling a kitchen, for example, kind of rely on this bias, and they make a lot of their money off of additional renovations, right? So this goes into how it's very difficult for us to look at the odds of failure. Say you're starting a business. Most businesses fail, right? It's very rare to have a successful business. And when you look at it, it almost makes, if you use the information that you have at hand, it makes more sense to quit before you start. But that's not necessarily the go-to motive, which brings us into this idea of optimism, right? So optimism is a incredibly beautiful trait to have. It's something that is inherited, according to Kahneman. So people who have a proclivity to being an optimist are a lot of the time more successful. A lot of the time they're healthier, they have better well-being. They have this innate feeling that they're lucky, right? Which is a great feeling to have. Nothing can go wrong. I'm very lucky. Who wouldn't want to move forward and act in the world as if you can't fail? That'd be a great trait to have. Moreover, they're liked by people. You want to be around people that are optimistic. You don't want to be around cynical people. You don't want to be around people that are pessimistic. It feels great to be around someone who has this idea that they're going to succeed. It's very tangible. You feel it in the air, right? So this is something that you kind of want to, in some cases, disregard the statistics that are against you. Kahneman did this. He said he only had like a 40% success, odds of a 40% success in terms of building this curriculum, but they didn't give up. They adjusted their view using this new idea of 7 years as an anchor to move forward from, and they went forward and attempted against all odds to build this curriculum, which is something that all great entrepreneurs do, right? You're not overly optimistic, and you don't ignore the statistics in entirety, because again, these algorithms and these statistics are great predictors of success or failure, and it's very hard to overcome these. But if you have a sliver of chance in terms of overcoming these, maybe you can, right? It doesn't necessarily make sense to ignore your own faith in yourself and to just to give up because the statistics say that you're going to fail. That's not what he's pointing at. He's pointing at having a realistic idea, having a set point or an anchor to have a more objective view of reality, and to understand that while your initial idea of how things are going to go and your initial view of how long it's going to take, they may not be accurate, and your odds for success may not be as great as they are, but you can utilize this new information to have a more realistic worldview of how well something will go for you. So he titled this chapter "The Engine of Capitalism," which I think is great, right? This idea of optimism is what is fueling people to move forward and conquer their dreams, right? And to grasp the thing that they want to grasp, right? So, however, not being realistic, like I already said, I'm going to reiterate this again, not being realistic won't help you. You should still use these algorithms that are great predictors of success, better than your average person who's biased. These algorithms can give you a more realistic view of how you should move forward and in what way you should move forward, as well as how long something's going to take, how much money, the odds of success, so on and so forth. So thanks for anyone who tuned in, and I will be back next week with part 4.